Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. I'm Garrett.
And I'm Sabrina.
And today, in our 459th episode, we've got the last episode of our Beyond Bones mini-season.
Yeah, it's about soft tissues that have to do with breathing and tendons.
Oh, that's specific. It's like it's organs and ligaments and tendons.
Kinda, yeah.
To be general about it. And we also have Dinosaur of the Day, Titanosaurus.
Which is somewhat related. We don't have too much to talk about soft tissue-wise, but we are talking a lot about sauropods in this episode.
So on topic with type of dinosaur, but not the soft tissue piece of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, I've got a fun fact. But before we get into all of that, we want to thank some of our patrons. And this week, we'd like to thank Keith, Hoxie, Saskisaurus, Kate, Michael, It's Devon Baby, Leo, T-Bear, Paul B., and Karen.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being part of our Dino-It-All community. We hope you enjoy all of the perks that come with it. And because of our patrons, we're able to do stuff like mini-seasons on dinosaur soft tissues.
Yeah, it gives us a little more freedom because otherwise every title would need to be like T-Rex or Spinosaurus or whatever if we only relied on ad revenue and number of listeners.
But with our community behind us, we can experiment a little bit. So thank you. All right, we're at the end of our mini-series Beyond Bones on dinosaur soft tissue, and this episode we'll be talking a lot about some recent research from last year and this year. I want to say thank you to Tito, who's the lead author on a couple of the papers we'll be talking about, for sending us the papers that have to do with soft tissue, specifically related to respiratory systems. This first paper was published in the Anatomical Record. It's open access, so anyone can check it out, by Tito Aureliano, Aline Gilardi, and others. And it has to do with sauropods.
Oh, good.
Like I teased at the beginning of the episode. So sauropods, we know they could get so big because of their bird-like air sac system. But how did that system originate? The earliest dinosaurs didn't have skeletal pneumaticity in their bodies or air spaces in the bones. And these invasive air sacs evolved independently in theropods, sauropodomorphs, and pterosaurs. And we talked a little bit about that a paper that Aline and others published in 2022.
Yeah, so even if the invasiveness of the air sacs evolved independently, we think they may have had a common ancestor that had some type of air sac, which again is sort of an extension of the lung in a really fancy way. At least we think that was likely the case, because a lot of times when you have a bunch of animals that share something in common, you think, okay, maybe they had a common ancestor that also had that.
Yeah, makes sense to me. For this paper, they analyzed the sauropodomorph macrocolumn. It lived in the late Triassic in what's now southern Brazil. It's from about 225 million years ago.
That's an old one.
Yeah. What's cool is there's an almost complete, well-preserved, articulated skeleton that could be studied.
Yeah, it's pretty uncommon, especially for the Triassic.
Yeah. There's unfused parts of the bones for the skeleton, so it might be a subadult, but no histology has been done yet, so we don't know for sure. The team CT scanned vertebrae from the neck and back, and they found evidence of air sacs. In fact, it's the oldest known invasive air sac system in Sauropodomorpha. I always think it's funny that it's called invasive air sac system because it really helped out the sauropods.
Yeah, it sounds like something that's attacking it.
Yeah, like a parasitic air sac system.
But really it just means that the air sacs are in the bones a little bit,
yeah,
rather than just in the other soft tissue of the body.
Yes, and they're in a lot of places. The pattern of the air sacs in the neck and back vertebrae is unique in non-sauropod sauropodomorphs, which could mean that this clade didn't have a consistent, extensive pattern of air sacs until the eusauropods in the Jurassic. The eusauropods are the ones that I think most people think of when they think of sauropods.
What was most of sauropod history was as eusauropods, I guess I would say. Maybe neosauropods. But yeah, the big ones.
Yeah, the most famous ones, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
In macrocolumn, they also found several fossae, which are shallow depressions, connected with internal pneumatic chambers, or air sacs, and the chambers are, quote, a new type of tissue with an intermediate texture, end quote. The authors proposed a new term, protocamerate chambers. Before there were only two chambers, camerae and camellae, and this new one, the protocamerate chambers, has properties of both. Just for reference, camerae are large air cavities separated by thick bony partition internally and laminae externally, a thin layer, and camellae are small air cavities separated by thin bony trabeculae, a group of partitions made by connective tissue. So camerae, more simply, has the large air cavities, camellae has the small ones. The new pneumatic tissue is evidence of delicate, thin tissue forming larger chambers and changes the previous hypothesis that the air sacs first evolved into camerae and then later into the more delicate camellae. As the paper put it, macrocolumn is an example of the gradual evolution of skeletal tissues responding to the fastly specializing respiratory system of Saurischian dinosaurs.
So it's not just like they evolved these big air cavities in camerae, and then later the camellae came with a more complex small air cavity network, because we've got now something before the camerae that's already big but has a more delicate structure, just like the camellae does.
Yeah, I think so. And it just kind of shows how complex this whole system was. There were even more types of tissue than we knew before.
And it all happened really early,
Mm.
way back in the Triassic with the sauropodomorphs.
So the next paper is about soft tissue that correlates to the air sacs in dinosaur skeletons and their lungs. This one was published by Tito Aureliano, Aline Gilardi, and others, and it was published in the Zoological Journal of the Linnaean Society. And for this study, the team analyzed 6 specimens, 3 titanosaurs, 2 theropods, and a pterosaur, all found in Brazil. It was more specifically, and not, this isn't terribly specific, but an indeterminate Spinosaurinae, an indeterminate Megaraptora, and the titanosaurs Ibirania, Arudatitan, and Uberabatitan.
So they figured out the Titanosaurus, but the other ones are not sure about.
Yes.
The theropods they're not sure about, in other words.
Yes. Now, they did histology on these specimens to look for pneumosteal bone. Quote, pneumosteum is a peculiar type of secondary bone similar to tiny hair-like structures, which correlates with postcranial skeletal pneumaticity and thus to the lungs and their diverticula, end quote. So they're small air-filled bags that extend from the air sacs and lung. According to a 2017 paper by Marcus Lamberts and others, pneumosteum are densely packed fine fibers that were in contact with air sacs. So it's a type of bony tissue. And so that means finding these tiny hair-like structures correlates to the air sacs in dinosaur skeletons and their lungs.
So it's one of those, it indicates where the soft tissue is, but isn't itself a soft tissue.
That's a type of bony tissue.
Yeah. So a hard tissue, I guess, because it's a bone.
Now, it can be tricky distinguishing the pneumosteum from other bone tissue that connected to muscles and tendons, as opposed to air sacs. And this new study found the differences. The fibers or bony tissue are longer, thicker, and at different angles, depending on the type of bony tissue. And that's going to help a lot with future research on studying bone tissue and the evolving respiratory system of dinosaurs. So it's a good laying the groundwork for future research type of paper.
Yeah, and if you can figure out where all the air sacs were, that's really helpful in the future too, especially if you're worried about accidentally prepping away some soft tissue. It's good to know in the bone where the future air sacs might be found.
Look out for those tiny fibers.
Yeah.
We'll get into more soft tissues in a moment, but first, a quick break for our sponsors. Next up for our new soft tissue papers, there's a recent one about how soft tissue influenced how dinosaurs probably breathed, because it influenced their nasal passages. This one was published by Jason Burke and Lawrence Whitmer in Journal of Morphology, and it is open access. Now, nasal passages, they do a lot. Dinosaurs probably used them in similar ways to a lot of modern animals. The mucus in nasal passages protects against airborne pathogens. Nasal passages also help with regulating temperature and capturing odors, and they can act as resonators, which can be a form of communication.
Yeah, even with us, all our sinuses act as resonators. So when you're talking and you have a stuffed nose, you sound very different
That's
than
true.
if you don't.
I wasn't even thinking about that. Well, the way that things fossilize and preserve really limits what we know about dinosaur nasal passages because we pretty much only know the bony parts, not the soft tissue parts. And that makes it really hard to reconstruct them and know exactly what these nasal passages did and how they worked.
Yeah, because like if you look at our skull, it's hard to tell exactly how big our nasal passages are. You need to know the soft tissue around it,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and it makes a really big difference.
Yes. Now, dinosaurs are diapsids, so understanding modern diapsid nasal passages can help when it comes to understanding dinosaur nasal passages. We talked about diapsids in our recent bonus episode on Dimetrodon for our patrons, but the short explanation is that diapsids had two openings in their skull, hence the di.
It's sort of the group that we call reptiles. Not quite, because
Yeah.
reptiles is a weird term, but yeah, basically reptiles, things that you think of today with scales scurrying around. Those are diapsids.
And for reference, Dimetrodon is not a diapsid.
Even though it starts with di,
Yep.
it's a synapsid like us.
So for this paper, they compared the nasal passages of an alligator, turkey, ostrich, iguana, and monitor lizard. They dissected the animals and then they CT scanned the heads and then 3D modeled them. That way, they were able to study the airflow dynamics of nasal passages. And they first simulated how air moves in nasal passages with soft tissue. And then they digitally took away the soft tissue so that they only had the bony parts, the way a fossil is. So it was a good way to compare what we might be missing by not knowing the soft tissues of dinosaurs.
Mm-hmm.
The fossilized versions were slower flowing than the ones with soft tissue.
Oh, really? That's weird.
Yeah.
You'd think there'd be less restrictions when you get rid of the soft tissue and it would move quicker.
Yeah.
Oh, although in fluid mechanics, if you're doing like a similar volume, the narrower the space is, the faster it moves. So if they're talking about the velocity and not the volume, those are different things.
Well, the biggest differences they found were that with soft tissue, the nasal vestibule was larger, the anterior or front part of the nasal cavity, and they saw the largest difference in the alligator.
Oh, so it's kind of like us. We need our nose out there. That gives us more of a vestibule, I guess.
There's also differences in the removal of conchae, which are structures of thin bone or cartilage in the sides of the nasal cavity. They found similar airflow patterns for all species while resting. All the species had airfield partitioning, but the birds had the most subdivided airfield. And all species had at least one air channel with air that went into the animal's olfactory region, where they could smell. For all but the turkey, it was slower moving air. They found that turkeys weren't as good at separating and distinguishing airborne particles compared to ostriches. So it sounds like ostriches might have a better sense of smell.
Yeah, not all birds could smell that well. They're mostly visual like us.
They wrote, our interpretation received some support from field observations of wild turkeys, which readily eat shelled corn placed next to mothballs. Similarly,
That's a whole separate question. Why is shelled corn placed next to mothballs?
Just to see if they would eat them? I don't know.
I wonder if it's like they just put mothballs to keep moths away from the corn or something. That's really weird.
They also wrote, similarly, domestic turkeys, unlike domestic fowl, show no preference for solid, high ammonia content or unsoiled substrates when given a choice, end quote. So they're not picky.
Yeah, because they can't smell very well.
Yeah.
So they just eat whatever.
If it looks good, I guess.
Yeah.
And some of the animals had sinuses, they also found. In the simulations with just the bones, the airflow was different. It was slower, it was not as divided, and there was more airway stagnation. Sometimes they showed, quote, similar, albeit cruder patterns to their soft tissue counterparts, end quote. in the turkey, iguana, and monitor lizard, the airflow made some spiral motions, so some aspects of the bones affect how the air moves, and the soft tissues, quote, act more to augment and refine these characteristics, end quote. But only reconstructing the bones likely underestimates nasal passages' capabilities. The authors wrote, quote, the larger empty nasal passages typically reconstructed are not capable of achieving the natural flow patterns observed in the living animals, resulting in unrealistic aspects of nasal physiology, such as weak heat transfer capacity and reduced olfaction in dinosaurs with well-developed olfactory lobes, end quote.
Yeah, the heat transfer is a whole separate topic. I think we talked about it a little bit with Ankylosaurus, where it's got its brain and it's sort of completely covered in armor. And so in order to keep its brain cool, because it couldn't just sort of radiate directly through the skull, I guess the way our brain does, I don't really know, but I presume so. They had a bunch of blood vessels near it, and then they think in its nose, basically that was the radiator for the brain. And for sure, you need a bunch of soft tissue to get all that blood close to the air.
Yeah, so I guess we're learning a little bit more about what we don't know. We can still learn from the bony airways. Like you can see some flow patterns, and when you compare them to animals with soft tissue, you can, quote, identify regions of airflow that may have been real, end quote.
That may have been real.
I guess we'll never know for sure, or it's really hard to know for sure. However, soft tissue nasal passages could compress the airway. They saw this in all the specimens. They saw this even in the ostrich, and it's been seen in previous studies with giraffes and oxen, which indicates that, quote, even large animals should be expected to have extremely narrow nasal passages. Diversity of nasal passage shape becomes a byproduct of the different ways in which each species solves their common diffusion problem, end quote. So, this may mean that previous reconstructions of dinosaur nasal passages, quote, grossly overestimate airway size, end quote. And this would affect what we think of how well dinosaurs could smell or keep themselves cool or even affect their metabolic rate. The authors wrote, quote, reconstruction of soft tissues in dinosaur nasal passages, including the restoration of estimated mucosal thickness, which I'm sure is very hard to estimate.
The amount of mucus in the nose.
Yeah. Can improve aspects of nasal passage physiology, such as promoting airflow into the olfactory region of pachycephalosaurs and increasing heat transfer efficiency in ankylosaur noses by up to 11%, end quote.
There you go. There's that heat transfer ankylosaur brain cooling.
Exactly.
11% isn't a huge change, but it's something.
Oh, I was thinking that is kind of a big difference. They did say that the resolution of their CT scans varied, and that could affect things. And they also had a yearling alligator. It was young, 1 or 2 years old, that may have had different results compared to if they looked at an adult alligator. But I think it's really interesting just how much soft tissue can affect things and affect what we think we know about dinosaurs.
Yeah. Plus, we really don't know dinosaurs compared to birds and alligators, how much soft tissue they had. That's like a constant debate of, like, did they have lips? Did they have this? Did they have that? Did they have big skin hanging off their neck?
Yeah.
Or was it more tight against the body? We can get some of that detail from skin impressions around the animals, but it's really hard to say. And comparing to alligators is tricky since they're like an aquatic animal. They have more reptilian, to use an informal term, scales than something like birds do. But then birds are also different because they basically all have beaks and none of them have teeth, and they're totally covered in feathers, so they don't need the same type of soft tissue that animals without feathers need. So yeah, it's messy.
Yeah.
But I guess in terms of breathing, it might be kind of similar.
It just got me thinking a lot about human noses and how if you were to look at a skeleton of a human, you would have no idea what the shape of the nose is.
Yeah. Or even like an elephant, missing the trunk entirely, where they thought it was like a cyclops at first when they first found him.
Yeah.
It's easier to just imagine like filling in a space than it is to think of a big fleshy thing hanging off the head.
I do like the paleo art that shows the big fleshy things, though. For now, I think it's a lot of speculation. But last but not least, there was a recent paper about soft tissues in dinosaur tendons. This was written by Dawood Surmic and others and published in the Zoological Journal of the Linnean Society and is also open access. A lot of good open access papers for this episode. They analyzed the structure of dinosaur fossilized tendons. And fossilized soft tissue hasn't been documented in ossified tendons before. It had been in bones and cartilage.
Oh, okay. So I was wondering when you said soft tissue in tendons, I was like, isn't a whole tendon soft tissue? But you're talking about soft tissues in ossified tendons, which are the ones that are like really stiff from like calcifying or whatever you want to call it. So they basically look like bone. But you're saying there's still a little bit of nimbly bimbly flexible bit in the middle of it.
Some soft tissue, yeah. In this study, they found tendons and blood vessels in late Cretaceous ornithischians from North America and Central East Asia. They studied the tendons specifically of Homalocephali, a pachycephalosaur, and Pinacosaurus, an ankylosaur from Central Mongolia, and Edmontosaurus, a hedrosaur from Alaska in the US. And they found, quote, for the first time, the presence of fibrous structures, end quote. Specifically, they had 3 specimens of Edmontosaurus from the Prince Creek Formation, 2 tail tendons from a juvenile Homalocephali from the Lameta Formation, 2 samples of tail tendons from Pinacosaurus from the Lameta Formation, and they also took tendons from the lower leg of a turkey, which came from a food-breeding poultry farm that was bought in a local butcher shop.
I love it when one of their samples is just like, we went to the store and bought a chicken or a turkey.
Yeah. But it's helpful to have that bird comparison.
Yeah, I guess in this case, they got a whole leg. So they had to go to a butcher shop so that they got the tendons and everything, because a lot of times that's already been removed.
They did histology, scans, x-rays, and 3D imaging of their samples. And they also demineralized some fragments of the fossilized tendons to see if any soft parts were preserved. There was no fossilized soft tissue from Pinacosaurus. But they found vascular canals and brown and orange tubular structures in Homalocephali. And they found lots of rust to brown, dark to translucent structures in Edmontosaurus, which looked like blood vessels. And they found cell-like structures also in Edmontosaurus. And there were a lot of similarities with the turkey tendon. That's why you need your comparison.
So to recap, you've got nothing from Pinacosaurus, the ankylosaur, a little bit from Homalocephali, the pachycephalosaur, and a whole bunch from the hadrosaur.
Yes.
As we're used to with hadrosaur mummies always having the best soft tissue.
Good job, hadrosaurs. In terms of how old these specimens were, the Edmontosaurus is probably a relatively young individual. The Homalocephali was probably a juvenile, and the Pinacosaurus was probably an adult, which maybe that changed things in terms of how things were preserved. I don't know.
Yeah. Or that they were different species or entirely different groups.
Yeah. They were also buried in different types of environments.
Oh, yeah. So totally different chemistry, too.
Yeah. That definitely made a difference in preservation of soft tissue. The iron in the sediments especially made a difference. Iron is a big thing when it comes to preserving soft tissue. Like, that keeps coming up over and over in our episodes. The author said detailed studies on this is beyond the scope of the paper, though, and it'll be developed in the future. Pinacosaurus was buried in a semi-arid climate with sand dunes and heavy rainfall. Homalocephali was buried in sediments deposited by flowing water, and Edmontosaurus was buried in a coastal plain environment. Now, in all the tendon samples, they found some sort of fibrous structures. The shapes, sizes, striped patterns, and location of the fibers are consistent with collagen-like patterns, so they may have been made of collagen, which is protein found in skin and other connective tissues. It seems that tendon ossification is common for birds and dinosaurs, and the soft tissue is preserved from cross-linking from iron and glycation, and we talked about that in the first episode of this mini-series, how that works. As we've talked about with previous studies too, that shows that there's different ways that soft tissue gets preserved, and it all depends on how the animal is buried, at least its environment, when it comes to how well it preserves.
Yeah. And a little bit, some of the chemistry of the animal itself is an impact. You talked about too, if it had like more calcium, for example, in that part of its body or something.
Yeah. It's kind of a new field, or it's a fairly new field of study, and I expect we'll see a lot of cool things coming out of it because, Yeah, there just seem to be more and more papers on related to soft tissue. We'll move on to our dinosaur of the day in a moment, but first, we'll take a quick break for our sponsors. And now on to our dinosaur of the day, Titanosaurus, which was a request from Tyrant King via our Patreon and Discord. So thanks.
It's a familiar sounding name.
Yes. Named after the mythological Titans, which are the pre-Olympian gods in Greek mythology, and there were 12 of them.
Oh, I know. I couldn't name them, but I know there were a dozen of them.
Titanosaurus was a dubious titanosaur, sauropod, that lived in the Late Cretaceous in what is now India, in the Lameta Formation.
It happens, you know. I assume that titanosaurs are named for Titanosaurus.
Yes.
But you get that with ceratops and ceratopsians. It's just maybe troodon and troodontids, depending on who you ask.
Yeah.
Sort of a long history of the namesake of a group later becoming dubious.
Yes.
Because you tend to call the group based on early finds, and early finds often later turn out not to be as diagnostic or as specific to one individual dinosaur species as you think they are when you first find it. And you're like, oh, look at this amazing feature. And then it turns out later, like, oh, yeah, 20 different animals had that.
Yeah. And that's exactly what happened with Titanosaurus.
Sorry, spoiler alert.
But let's just say for now it wasn't dubious. In that case, being a sauropod, it would have walked on all fours and had a long neck and a small head, and its neck was thick and its tail was short.
Well, whatever this dinosaur was, it probably looked like that.
Yeah. It's unclear how large Titanosaurus was. Again, it's dubious, plus not many fossils were found to begin with. But anyway, the type species is Titanosaurus indicus. The genus name means Titanic lizard. It was described by Richard Lydecker in 1877, and it's the first dinosaur from India to be named and officially described. It was named based on a partial femur or leg bone and 2 incomplete tail vertebrae, and it was named for details in the tail vertebrae. There was a second species, Titanosaurus blandfordi, that was also named by Richard Lydecker in 1879, so 2 years later. And Titanosaurus blandfordi was named based on a tail vertebrae that was found sometime between 1860 and 1870 by William Blandford. Which makes sense then.
That it became Blandfordi.
Mm-hmm.
So many Williams in the 1800s involved in paleontology.
That's true. And 14 species of Titanosaurus have been named. And these species have been found in Argentina, Europe, Madagascar, India, and Laos. And if all 14 species were valid, then Titanosaurus would have spanned 60 million years.
That's a long time for a genus.
Yeah, and a lot of different places.
Yeah. That weren't connected necessarily.
Yeah. Later Titanosaurus species were named based on fossils found in Argentina and Madagascar by 1896, and that led to the idea that Titanosaurs were Gondwanan. The holotype vertebrae was found in 1828 by Captain William Henry Sleeman of the East India Company Army.
Wow, that was way before it was named.
Mm-hmm. He found the fossils on Barasimla Hill near the gun carriage factory while looking for petrified wood. And Sleeman discovered the fossils just 4 years after Megalosaurus was named in 1824, and 14 years before Richard Owen coined the term Dinosauria in 1842.
So the second dinosaur named, or maybe third dinosaur named, could have been Titanosaurus?
It could have been, but it took a while.
Yeah.
It took over 50 years to get named. Sleeman wrote, quote, "I made the first discovery of fossil remains in the Nerbudda Valley. I went first to a hill within sight of my house in 1828 and searched exactly between the plateau of basalt that covered it and the stratum immediately below, and there I found several small trees with roots, trunks, and branches, all entire and beautifully petrified. They had only been recently uncovered by the washing away of a part of the basaltic plateau. I soon after found some fossil bones of animals," end quote. So the reason it took so long to name Titanosaurus is Sleeman gave 2 pieces to G.G. Spilsbury, a surgeon, who also excavated a third bone, and then sent the fossils in 1832 to an antique dealer, James Prinsep, in Calcutta, who figured out that they were fossils and sent them back to Sleeman.
So he didn't realize they were fossils before?
I think he did, but I think there was just some confusion.
Oh, because he was an antique guy and he was like, I don't want this.
Yeah, I don't know the details because it's hard to figure out the details of an antique dealer from the 1830s.
Yeah. It does make you wonder, are fossils technically antiques? They kind of are, in a
Yeah.
way. But I think to be an antique, it has to be a man-made object.
Well, by 1862, Hugh Falconer, superintendent of the Geological Survey of India, had the vertebrae, and he thought it was reptilian, so he took measurements and illustrated them. Then Medlicott found a fragmentary leg bone, a femur, in 1871 from the same area that the vertebrae were found. And after Falconer died, Lydekker finally described them as Titanosaurus indicus. Lydekker knew it was a dinosaur and said there were unique features in the tail vertebrae but not in the femur. He wrote, quote, "If the femur had been found alone, I should have referred it to the genus Cetiosaurus, but the vertebrae forbid this view," end quote.
They forbid it.
Yes. The femur and vertebrae came from the same place, but not from the same layer or stratigraphic level. And because of this, in 1933, Friedrich von Huene and Charles Matley referred the femur to Antarctosaurus, which is a titanosaur found in Argentina. Why were fossils in India referred to a dinosaur genus from South America? Well, at the time, the other fossils found in India couldn't be compared with Titanosaurus indicus because they had several things in common with Antarctosaurus. Also, Lydekker had set a precedent for linking dinosaurs across Gondwana when he identified Titanosaurus species in Madagascar and South America. And von Huene thought that there was a land bridge in the Cretaceous between South America and Southeastern Asia.
Oh, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we think that anymore. You got to go through North America or a whole bunch of other continents.
Yeah, I think that's what we usually talk about now. So after von Huene and Matley in 1933, it took more than 50 years until the next discovery of late Cretaceous dinosaurs in India. There were abelosaurid and titanosaurid skeletons in eggs and nest sites found in 1981. In 2003, Jeffrey Wilson and Paul Upchurch reevaluated Titanosaurus and all 14 species.
Oh my God. That's so many species.
Yes. They had to look at a lot of details on the bones there. Titanosaurus was a wastebasket taxon for a while, the 14 species. Not as big of a wastebasket taxon as other species, I think.
That's pretty big, though.
Yeah.
I was thinking that when you said they added them from South America and India and Madagascar. Sounds like a wastebasket.
Yeah. But I think there are genera that had more than 14 species at one point. Anyway, they found Titanosaurus indicus, that's the type 1, to be invalid because, quote, "it is based on obsolescent characters, once diagnostic features that have gained a broader taxonomic distribution over time," end quote. And It's like what you were saying earlier. Yeah, these features that were thought to be unique to Titanosaurus, turns out they're found in other titanosaurs.
It's like naming Ceratops based on it's a dinosaur with big horns. Later on, you find out there are tons of dinosaurs with big horns, and if that's all you could tell about it, it's not super valid anymore.
You don't know exactly what type of dinosaur, yeah. They did find the group Titanosauria to be still valid, though. And that's good, because we often talk about the titanosaurs as a group.
It would be frustrating if that wasn't valid.
Yeah. Now, to his credit, when Lydekker named the two species of Titanosaurus in the 1800s, only 115 dinosaur species had been named by that point. So, yeah, it would be hard to have these diagnostic features when you don't have much to compare to.
Yeah, and you can't tell in the future what else is going to be found.
But since Titanosaurus, a lot of titanosaurs and non-titanosaurs have been found with the same features in the tail vertebrae that had defined Titanosaurus, and that includes Diplodocus and Mamenchisaurus.
Oh boy. This is not just even Titanosaurus in general, it's all like tons of sauropods.
Yes. Some of the features are unique to Titanosauria, though, and others are found in other sauropod lineages. So some former species include Rahioliensis. It was named based on teeth. Now it's thought to be an indeterminate neosauropod. Colberti, which is now Icysaurus. Australis, which is now Nucensaurus. Nanis, which is another nomen dubium. Robustus, which is also now Nucensaurus. Madagascariensis. Phalati, which is too fragmentary to know, Valdensis, which is now a nomen dubium, Lydecari, that one's just unclear, and Dacus, which is now Magyarosaurus. Wilson and Upchurch wrote that, quote, history has stripped Titanosaurus of its uniqueness through obsolescence of the characters originally used to define it, end quote. Mostly like that turn of phrase, history has stripped Titanosaurus.
Yeah.
Now, Charles Matley collected more sauropod bones between 1917 and 1919 in the same area where Titanosaurus indicus fossils were found, but in a different layer. They were found, quote, washed about and somewhat damaged and broken before fossilization, end quote. They also found fragmentary bones in 1920 in the type locality of Titanosaurus blandfordi. The fossils were assigned to Titanosaurus indicus, Titanosaurus blandfordi, and Antarctosaurus, it was questionable what species, as well as Laplatosaurus madagascariensis and an indeterminate sauropod. 4 brain cases once attributed to Titanosaurus indicus were found in different localities in India, and one was from Barasimla, where the first Titanosaurus fossils were found. Supposedly they're found with some skeletal fossils, but those weren't mapped or described. There were enough differences in the brain cases that there were probably 2 sauropod taxa within them, and they were informally referred to Antarctosaurus and Titanosaurus morphs. Those are both in quotes.
Don't love that.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's no detailed field records, and fossils from Barasimla are not well preserved, which means the fossils found there are just confusing and controversial when it comes to which dinosaurs they belong to. In 1997, Jane and Bandyopadhyay said the quote-unquote Antarctosaurus septentrionalis was a junior synonym of Titanosaurus indicus because there weren't any big differences between the two. However, Wilson and Upchurch said that because the fossils came from Barasimla, which is, quote, a poor sample from which to determine variation, end quote, and that naming all fossils found at Barasimla as one species will, quote, not only create a potentially unnatural assemblage, it also forces future discoveries of presently unknown elements to be referred to it, end quote.
So in other words, don't just name everything the same species just because it comes from the same quarry.
Exactly.
Or even the same formation.
Yes. Wilson and Upchurch also found that Titanosaurus blandfordi was not valid because the features on its tail vertebrae that Lydecker described are features that may vary among sauropods. It's more like individual variation, so it can't be a diagnostic feature. I'm just going to get into a little more of the details of some of the other species. So Titanosaurus rahoviensis was named based on teeth. That's not enough. Then there were fossils found in Madagascar, including the first record of dermal armor in a sauropod, and those were referred to Titanosaurus madagascariensis.
Well, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, except the dermal armor is not part of the holotype.
But still, the first ever evidence of dermal armor or osteoderms in a sauropod is super cool. I had no idea that came with Titanosaurus, or the sauropod formerly known as Titanosaurus.
Yes. Well, unfortunately, Wilson and Upchurch found Titanosaurus madagascariensis to be nomen dubium until it's further studied. The fossils, they include tail vertebrae, part of an arm, and that dermal ossification, though Deparay, when he described the fossils in 1896, wrote, quote, I refer to the same animal, but without absolute certainty, a large dermal ossification, end quote. Though the fossils were found in different localities.
That doesn't sound as good anymore.
No.
Like maybe that's a big piece of armor from some other animal.
Yeah, I hope it's from a sauropod.
Yeah, it happens.
An earlier study found Titanosaurus madagascariensis to be Laplatosaurus, but Wilson and Upchurch said that the comparisons were just too limited. Titanosaurus lydeckeri is only known from a tail vertebra, and they only know that that one belongs to a titanosaur, so that species is out. Oh, and Laplatosaurus was different from Titanosaurus because it was larger, but with more slender proportions. Titanosaurus colberti was named based on a partial skeleton, including part of the pelvis and forelimb, and they found Titanosaurus colberti to still be a valid species, but like I said, they gave it the new name, Icysaurus.
Which you can see in Prehistoric Planet.
Yes.
2. At the volcanoes.
Exactly. So Wilson and Upchurch found that of the 14 Titanosaurus species, only 5 were valid and only 4 of them were renamed. There was Nucensaurus, Magyarosaurus, Laplatosaurus, and Icysaurus. But they also mentioned Titanosaurus, in quotes, SP. So even though the paper said Titanosaurus is a nomum dubium, they still consider one species sort of, because the SP means it's not identified on the species level or it's not related to other known species.
But the fact that it's in quotes means that they don't think that it's going to stay in Titanosaurus, because if the Titanosaurus type species isn't valid, then a lot of times the genus name just goes away.
Yeah.
And everything else needs to be renamed.
That's true. It's such a good name, though.
It is. I mean, someone can always like appeal to the ICZN or whatever, make a stake a claim for why it should stay and give it a new species name.
Yeah, and maybe that'll happen. When it comes to the name Titanosaurus, it didn't help that the original Titanosaurus indicus and Blanfordi fossils also went missing for many years. It's unclear exactly when they went missing, but Janajay Mohabay found the fossils were only lost because there was no good inventory of the collection, so he started a study to find them, and then in 2012, he and Subasis Sengupta found the holotype vertebra of Titanosaurus indicus. It was in a batch of fossils that Lydecker had left behind in 1878, which is why it didn't have an official inventory number. And they also found the vertebrae of Titanosaurus blanfordi.
So it was so old that it had never been cataloged.
Yeah. Or just, it wasn't cataloged right when it was stored, and then, it just never was.
So it sat there for 144 years
Yep.
before someone cataloged it.
Well, at least they eventually found it. Now, titanosaurs, they were a very diverse group and have been found all over the world on all 7 continents. They lived until the end of the Cretaceous, and this group includes some of the largest land animals like Patagotitan, which is estimated to be about 121 feet or 37 meters long and weighs 76 tons. Though not all of them were large, like Magyarosaurus, that only weighed about 1 ton. Titanosaurs had wide chests and that wide-legged stance, and stocky forelimbs that were often longer than their hind limbs. Not many titanosaur skulls have been found, but based on the ones that have been found, they had small skulls. And some titanosaurs, like Saltosaurus, had osteoderms, so there are some armored sauropods out there.
Yeah, the Saltosaurs are the best. Some of them even had little tail clubs.
Oh, yeah.
Or at least I think they did.
Titanosaur eggs have been found, and they include embryos and preserved skin. Oh, so there is some soft tissue in here. So we are talking a little bit about soft tissues in this dinosaur of the day. Earlier this year in 2023, a bunch of titanosaur eggs were found in India. We talked about that in episode 430. They're from about 70 million years ago. The nests are packed tightly together, so it's likely that titanosaurs didn't stick around to take care of their young, because if they had, they might have trampled the nests. A 2015 study found embryonic skin from titanosaur eggs that were found in Patagonia, Argentina, and they found scale patterns that were similar to the patterns of osteoderms on Saltosaurus.
That's so cool.
Yeah. And also, to connect to the soft tissues in this episode, Titanosaurs had air sacs. Now, Titanosaurus, the dinosaur, is not to be confused with the kaiju Titanosaurus. Kaiju is a Japanese term, and it's a subgenre of science fiction about giant monsters like Godzilla. The kaiju Titanosaurus appeared in the 1975 film Terror of Mechagodzilla. In the movie, a mad scientist, Shinzo Mifune, like the museum.
It's true. It's spelled differently.
Yeah. Discovers the Titanosaurus and says that he can control its mind, and people think he's insane and he loses all credibility. He does end up controlling the Titanosaurus, and he gets his revenge. Apparently, before he controls the Titanosaurus was peaceful, so it's just kind of minding its own business. Now, in the movie, Titanosaurus is 196 feet or 60 meters tall and weighs over 30,000 tons.
When you said 196 feet, I wasn't expecting you to say tall. I was expecting a long.
I think they say tall because in the images I saw, it's standing upright. Yeah, it stands on its 2 legs and it has a tail that drags. It's designed to look like a spinosaur, and it's aquatic. It has a crocodile-like snout, a sail-like fin, and it roars. Well, the roaring doesn't have to do with it being a Spinosaur, but
Why did they just call it Spinosaurus?
I think because it's so large.
Because it's a titan,
Yeah, that could be it.
and they don't know anything about dinosaurs.
Well, it does have a long neck,
Oh, okay.
so that's something.
They didn't have Google back then, so I guess they couldn't Google Titanosaurus, see that it was already a thing. It's preoccupied. Come up with a new name.
Are you outraged?
Yeah.
Well, anyway, they gave it red, yellow, and black colors with a beige belly, and it could use its tail as a fan to create wind strong enough to destroy buildings or create whirlpools in water. It was a good swimmer, and it could also walk on land. And as spoiler, I mean, this whole thing has been kind of a spoiler, but it got defeated by Godzilla.
Doesn't everything lose to Godzilla in the Godzilla things?
I think so.
Because it's not like now the new kaiju movies have some other animal that's dominating everything.
Yeah. Always goes back to Godzilla.
It does. It's Godzilla versus the next thing.
So yeah, that was a fun one. And I did manage to get some soft tissue, not about Titanosaurus specifically, but Titanosaurs, we know a little bit about their soft tissues.
Yep, Titanosaurus's name lives on in the form of all the other Titanosaurs.
And that's good. We talk about Titanosaurs a lot on this show.
Mm-hmm. And our fun fact of the day builds a little bit on the soft tissue theme, and it's that T-Rex likely covered its teeth in large lips, and it probably didn't have the muscles to bear its teeth.
Ooh, back to this debate.
Yeah. So this comes from a recent article published by Thomas M. Cullen and others in Science. And one reason for their conclusion is that theropods, and by theropods, just quick recap, are most of the bipedal meat-eating dinosaurs. Those theropods have less wear on their teeth than expected for exposed teeth. So in other words, if their teeth were exposed all the time, they should be kind of worn out. But when you look at the actual fossilized teeth of theropods, they aren't that worn out. So it seems like maybe they weren't exposed all the time. Maybe they were protected by lips. For example, they compared them to modern crocodiles, which do have exposed teeth and get more worn out than it looks like theropod teeth did. But it isn't just the teeth quality that they were looking at. They looked into quite a few different aspects of dinosaur mouths and modern analogs to try to piece together whether or not they had skin or lips covering their teeth. Any sort of extra oral tissue, as they put it, sort of gets around like, is it a lip? Is it a muscle? You know, what is it exactly? They just call it extra oral tissue. You don't have to worry about it. It's just something covering the teeth is really what there's some good evidence for.
Some kind of soft tissue.
Yeah. So another piece of evidence is that there were small holes for nerves and blood vessels in theropod jaws, and the researchers found that theropods have holes more like a lipped lizard or tuatara than a crocodile, and lipped lizards and tuataras have fewer but larger holes closer to the mouth opening to support lips, while crocodiles have more smaller holes farther from the mouth for nerves rather than for lips. So they look more like lip holes than nerve holes.
Lip holes.
To put it another way. They also found that the huge teeth, even on a T-Rex, don't seem to be too big, like they're a limiting factor for being covered by lips. For example, the crocodile monitor, as it's commonly called, also known as Varanus salvadorii, has tooth crowns that are about 10% as long as its skull is long. So it's got 13.4 millimeter teeth in a 137 millimeter long skull, or a half-inch long teeth in a 5.5 inch long skull. So a pretty big tooth to head size ratio at around 10%. Being charitable, a T-Rex might approach 7% for a tooth crown to skull length ratio.
Oh, interesting.
So proportionally, its teeth are actually smaller than the crocodile monitor. So it's something I'd like to dig more into later.
Yeah. It's not that often something beats out a T-Rex.
No. Mark Whitten also pointed out in the conversation that the lips probably weren't muscled, so they wouldn't have been able to snarl or make expressions with their lips. They would have been more like lizard lips, where they basically open and close with the mouth, but there isn't really a whole lot of expression going on.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah. And I I think that's part of the reason why us mammals look at lizards as sort of like cold and unfeeling, is because their faces really don't have much expression compared to our faces.
Mm-hmm. We do a lot of nonverbal communication with our expressions.
Yeah, just with our cheeks and our mouths and everything. Additionally, if theropods had lizard-like lips, they may have had lizard-like gums that were much bigger and sort of puffier than we typically see depicted. For example, Komodo dragons have teeth that are almost as long as that Varanus salvadorii, although they have a bigger head, so the ratio isn't as impressive. But you can't see their teeth at all when they open their mouth because they're totally covered in gum, which is such a weird thing. And I've a few times tried to figure out like what is up with that. Why are their gums so huge? And I haven't found a satisfactory answer to that yet. So if anybody out there knows, is like an expert on Komodo dragons or otherwise why some lizards have such huge gums, let me know because I'm very interested in this question. But it just seems funny that maybe T-Rex also had like huge gums covering most of its teeth.
It's a very different depiction.
Yeah, and one that's hard to figure out because we haven't found much gum or lip soft tissue found in this fossil record to this point.
And on that curious note, that wraps up this episode of I Know Dino. Thank you so much for listening. Stay tuned. Next week, we have an interview with Maz Maddox, author of the dinosaur shifting series Relic. And if you enjoy listening to our podcast, please consider leaving a review. They really help us out. Thanks again, and until next time.